Hey everybody, it's Professor Beck. This week we have a guest visiting our class, Chilton Reynolds, Director of the Teaching Learning Technology Center, and my boss is joining us. And the topic of this week is assessment. And so we started thinking about assessment, started thinking about data in the last week. And I really liked how our chapter really focused us on student experience and efficacy. I thought that was a really powerful argument that the author of the textbook was putting forward. Our hope during this time is that we can just talk a little bit about assessment, talk about how we do it in the TLTC, the Teaching Learning Technology Center, and have that information for you as you think about how that corresponds into the K through 12 atmosphere. But what's really nice is that both Chilton and I came from the K through 12 experience before working in higher ed. So we have a little bit of that background, although it is becoming increasingly long since we've been in that in that classroom experience. We've been in our roles for quite a while. Chilton, you want to say anything to introduce yourself before we go right into questions?
Yeah, just I'll echo what Ed said. This is exciting for me because it is a kind of a coming back to my K-12 experience. I was a general ed music teacher in an elementary school for 5 years, and just enjoyed that experience so much. So happy to be here today and talk about assessment.
Yeah. So the first question that I've got for you is about your career trajectory, because you spent some time as a music teacher. They want to know, like, what made you want to be part of the TLTC? What aspects of that job drew you in? And if you could just share a little bit about your entire career trajectory, I think that'd be interesting for them.
Yeah. As I said before, I was an elementary school music teacher, and I got into technology because I struggled as a music teacher to be able to share what we're doing in the classroom. In a regular classroom, you send home papers every day. We sing music every day. We're playing instruments. So I got into technology as a way to record things that were going on in the classroom and share them. So I was creating a website. I was doing podcasting. We were doing a lot of recording, and I got into using technology and was fascinated by that. And then fascinated by how I could work with others to help them out. I then actually moved into a BOCES and worked at a BOCES for 5 years, where I was working in the technology integration for all the school districts in the Binghamton area, actually. And so that was fascinating, getting to work with different school districts with different abilities to how they assess using technology, how they implement technology, and really got a chance to see a lot of different ways that happened. And I realized how much I enjoyed doing this, and was intrigued by doing this at a higher education institution. And so when this job became available, applied for that as a way to be able to explore different technologies at a higher education institution instead of in K-12. So I've been in this job for 10 years now. Started out working with training and working with assessment of some technology tools and programs as we were going along. And in the last year have come into more of a leadership position inside of the TLTC. So it's been kind of for me, it's been a fun trajectory of using it in a classroom, exploring that, and then getting more and more into the back end of it and how we can support people in implementing different technologies.
Yeah, but I want to talk about that for a second, because I have a bias about technology that I've kind of inflicted on this class a little bit. For me, when I was teaching, it was like a eureka moment when I stopped worrying about what I was doing with the technology and started worrying about what the students were doing with the technology. Mm-hmm. But I think all of us that got into technology, we started because we were doing stuff with the technology. But I think that shifts over time, but it doesn't have to. So you were talking about the stuff that you did with technology, recording students. It wasn't that you were asking the students to do that. Could you share just a little bit more about that? Because I kind of keep coming from this argument of no, it's all about what the students do. And I keep saying that's a bias of mine that I need to be aware of. So talk for a little bit about the stuff that you did with the technology, because sometimes I'm a little bit derogatory towards smart boards and derogatory towards the technology that the teacher is manipulating and doing.
Yeah. For me, it was in the classroom, I wanted to be able to record. I wanted to be able to be in charge of that technology. And so focused on that to start off with. And I really enjoyed the technology and figuring it out, but then sharing how to use that technology with others. So I started by sharing that with other faculty. How do you do podcasting in the classroom? How do you take equipment in and be able to do this? But I came into this right around the time of Web 2.0, and so this whole empowerment idea of this web can be a place where everybody can be involved. Was an intriguing part of that we explored a lot. So we looked at things like DIGO, which was annotating bibliographies and trying to bring students together to be able to collaborate on that. It was right when blogs were first coming out and really becoming all the thing to do in K-12. And so it was a movement from like me focusing on what I want to do to like how do we do this responsibly in a way, especially in K-12 land, where you do have to think about privacy issues, you do have to think about bullying issues, you do have to think about a lot of repercussions when we ask all of our students to be involved in this stuff. And how do you do it in a way that's meaningful to students, but also safe for students to be able to do it? And so it was a fine line of, yeah, I love jumping into technologies and trying new stuff and doing this, and then taking a step back and thinking about how do we empower our students to use these tools in a proper way, to be able to really make it a meaningful experience for them.
Yeah.
Did I get at your answer?
Yeah, I think so. And it kind of leads in nicely to the next question. And this is just coming from another one of the students that said, okay, can you tell though, even before you implement a technology, don't you kind of know how it's going to go? And if you start to build this innate awareness of what's going to go well and what's not going to go well, what are the like attributes of the tool? What are the things that you're looking for that like clue like this is going to be a good experience for my students?
Yeah, we one of our main jobs, I feel like, when you're looking at technology, is weeding out tools that you think are not going to be good. And so I would say, yes, you can tell from the beginning of, is a tool going to be something that I even want to consider or not in the classroom. We've talked a lot about Facebook over the years and whether that's a good or bad tool. We continue to come back to that conversation because there are great tools, but then there are tools where you're like, no, I definitely don't want my students in this space because it's just going to be an open space where they're going to see all sorts of inappropriate content, right? So we can put some guardrails around what we even want to look at and implement to begin with. For me, when we're talking about implementing something, what we're really implementing is not necessarily a tool, but there's a need that needs to be filled. And so for me, it's more focusing on what's the need that we have at that moment. For me, the need was having a space to be able to post things where we could share what was going on in the classroom with the parents. And so we have these needs, and then we say, what are the tools that can fit into that? And so, yes, I think you can say from the outset, like there are definitely tools that we don't want to look at in that. There are tools we want to do look in that space, and be able to think about that. And so when we start a new project, it's usually coming from a place of we have a need for something. One of the big projects we've worked on recently is open educational resources. The need there was for students to be able to have textbooks that they have to purchase at an affordable rate. That was the need. And then we went out and started to look at a lot of technologies. Ed and I worked a lot on this of where do we go? Where do we look to find tools that are suitable for this? Sometimes they pop up. Sometimes like, oh, our school district already has this tool that will work good enough. And sometimes you're like, we don't have something that fits this. We need to go outside and look at something else. We were looking at a project on adaptive learning recently, where we were going out and evaluating a whole bunch of tools. There was a group of us that worked together and said, here are the strengths and weaknesses of different ones. And so we could be able to kind of think through some of those parameters around the need, and then think about which tool would make the most sense, tool or tools make the most sense from the perspective we have right now to see if that would be useful.
Yeah, this next question kind of feeds into that. Again, the students asking, what's the best method to collect data to ensure students are learning?
And I'm intrigued by that question because it's I'm assuming when the student is asking this, and I apologize if my assumption's wrong here, but I'm assuming that you mean, are they learning the technology that we're putting out there, or are there changes in their learning based off of the technology? We could have a whole discussion just around assessment of student learning, and Ed and I could probably do a whole nother hour just on that. Because for me, what I want to make sure is that they have an authentic assessment to show that they are learning whatever it is that we're talking about. When it comes to technology, a lot of the technologies that we implement aren't always about boosting learning. So I just want to kind of start off by saying that sometimes we are doing this to give them more of a digital citizenship experience. Sometimes the learning isn't necessarily, are they getting better grades in classroom, but are they becoming more aware of the tools that are around them? What does it look like if we ask them to go out and cite 3 websites and how they can do that appropriately? That can be a different type of learning than, are they getting better math scores? And so I think we have to be careful when we think about implementing technology and saying it's always going to be about bettering their learning. We do want to make it about bettering their experience and making it a more authentic experience. I get attracted to technology tools because a lot of times it's about having an experience where it's not just a conversation between the student and the teacher, but it can become a conversation where the audience can be bigger. So when a student's writing, they're not just thinking about what does my teacher want to hear, but they're thinking about what would this look like if my parents read this, if my grandparents read this, if somebody else read this. And so when we think about how we can expand the reach of it being an authentic experience for the students, sometimes that's the learning that happens there, and it's not necessarily bettering their grades. And I don't know if I get exactly the answer or the question that the student was asking, but
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think we need to pull this question apart a little bit, because I think when we see the word assessment in K through 12, sometimes we think, oh, we must mean assessment of learning. And that does not have to be true. I'm going to repeat that. We don't always have to assess student learning. We should be assessing our goals, but our goal doesn't always have to be learning or an improvement in learning. It might be a different sort of learning that we're trying to expose the students to. It may just be for variety. It may be to target a particular problem. Chilton brought up digital citizenship, or did you bring up digital citizenship? I inflicted that on them earlier in the class. We spent a lot of talk about digital citizenship because it's one of those ISTE standards. But let's throw that out and not do digital citizenship, because we've done that as a class together already, and think about the creative builder standard from ISTE, right? There's other standards from ISTE. There's other standards throughout all of our curriculums and all of our paradigms that we're working in. So if we're thinking about creative builder, maybe one of the goals was just to have them build something a little bit different, or have them build something digital. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be, oh, and there was a 3-point boost. And in this way, I want you to start to think about, there's something a little bit different between a research study and an assessment. Both you have to have goals. Both you have to be to use data to support what happened. But in assessment, we can really think about, okay, how are we telling the story of what happened here? And so telling the story may just be counting. Oh, throughout the district, we had 57 podcasts created by 100 students. That's counting. We're telling the story. It may be about the skills that are in there. Oh, not only were students recording, but they were also learning how to mix and add royalty-free music to the podcasts. Oh, okay. We're telling the story of the competencies that they're learning about. Oh, but that made us visit the librarian who had to explain to us a little bit about copyright and a little bit about what we even mean by royalty-free music. So they were exposed to that. That was a different form of learning. And this doesn't have to be a formal research paper that we're writing. This might be the little article that goes into the district newsletter that goes out every month. This might be a letter home to parents about what's going on in your class, or this might be how you're communicating with your principal and with your coworkers about what's going on in your class, because that stuff's really important too. Chilton, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think anytime you can link back to a framework when you're talking about this, the better. We mentioned the ISTE standards, which I think are a great way to talk about that, especially with technology. So you can say that story can have some type of backbone to it. We're doing this because we want to have more creativity in the classroom, and that's backed up by what they say in ISTE. One of my favorite ones in the ISTEs is the one where you can apply current knowledge to future things. And so, right, so if you know a word processing thing in Word, Word, then when you go to a Mac and you're working on pages, then you still should be able to do that. You can take what you know in one space and think about a new place. Application in a new space is one of the powerful ones there. So having some type of framework to be able to lay some of this assessment on as part of that story, where you can say, yes, there's a story, but yes, there's more to it than just the story, that we're also connecting into things that are going on nationally and internationally in the case of ISTE standards.
Yeah. And the other thing I'm going to say about the ISTE standards is they're not the end all be all.
Yeah.
It's not the only thing out there. It's not that we just love the ISTE standards, but what we have found is that it's helpful to benchmark ourselves against something else so that we can articulate our vision, we can articulate our goals. Then the assessment goes in and says, did we achieve those goals that we initially set out to reach? Right? That's what we've got to assess. And that might take up a lot of different data points that we kind of tell our story about. And here's just like getting out of the content a little bit and getting into like the advice for young professionals. Notice what your principal and what your district values, and figure out how to talk about the innovations that you want to do in your class in terms of the things that your district and your principal values. So if your principal is talking about some kind of framework they really like, align your assessment to that framework. Align what your data capturing to that framework, because if that's where they're willing to spend their time and energy and possibly even some money, because there might be times where something requires an investment. You want a field trip, you want to go someplace, you want a new piece of technology. Being able to align with that is something that's really important. That's something that we've done in the TLTC recently. There's a group in higher ed that publishes what they call high impact practices. And so we've aligned a lot of our work to those high impact practices in order to do that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that was where I was thinking about going next and saying next too, was anytime you can know who you are talking to and who your audience is for this, and then align to the goals of that, the better off. We are constantly looking at the missions and values of our university. When I was in elementary education, I actually got my podcasting stuff through a grant that you had to that you had to apply for money for. And so to be able to know what they're looking for, to be able to know what you need to align to, it helps a lot. Sometimes you have a lot of flexibility with that and can be able to pull in things. That's where ISTE is nice, because it's kind of a good backup. But I'm with Ed in saying, if there's things on your district that your principal's saying, your district superintendent saying, those are the things you should key into first, and then bring in other frameworks as necessary to be able to do that.
Yeah, it can be really powerful to crosswalk different things. So if your superintendent is all about this group of standards, and maybe you really like ISTE, I'm going to go back, keep going to ISTE just because it can keep the thread of the conversation. But I see where this district priority aligns very nicely with this ISTE standard. This district priority aligns very nicely with this district standard. And then when we talk about assessment, what is the data that I can say that helps support that story? It could be qualitative. It could be, here's a shining example. Here are my top 3 projects from the podcast story. Look, we're going to highlight them on the class website or in the newsletter. Or it can be more quantitative, where you're counting and saying, okay, we had this much done. We provided these many hours of instruction. We did this activity, and you're counting numbers. But either way, be able to report on that so that somebody can say like, okay, I see what you've done here, right? All that little evidence that you're gathering. Chilton, I don't know if we've covered this question already. Do you have any other advice for students who are learning how to assess technology, other than, really keying on district and school priorities, and being able to collect that evidence?
I would always keep in mind who your audience is that you're talking with. If you're going up for a district grant, that might be a group of faculty, or a group of other teachers that you're talking with. That would be different, the report that I might give than one that I'm giving to my superintendent. And so I would think about who the audience is at any time for what the message you're sending out with that assessment. And then, and I'd echo what Ed said of, there's going to be sometimes where you just need data. You need numbers to be able to say this many students did this thing. But the compelling stories are also the ones where you can find those meaningful experiences for 1 or 2 students. When I was doing podcasting, I actually had some students that really got into it. They like to do the editing, and a couple of them were students that had trouble actually reading. We would do a lot of reading, and so I had 1 or 2 students that loved to record something and then go back and edit it so that they took out all of their stumbles. And when they listened to it again, they were able to hear themselves be able to talk, and it sounded very smooth, and they were intrigued by that. And so when you can find those stories of like, here's where it made a big impact on one person, can be just as beneficial as the impact on everybody. And you have to balance those two. You can't just rely on those 1 or 2 stories of impact on 1 or 2 students, but they really drive in the point of that data when you say, 500 of our 1,000 students did this, but also here's how it could be meaningful to 1 or 2 students as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're able to tell the story that says every student did this, 100 students across the district did this, here's a notable example, here's a story, here's a quote from a parent who was talking about what happened. Like you're building this, like, how do I tell my story program? And that's going to be really, really important for the things that take time in your classroom, and especially things that require investment. If it requires district funds, if it requires budget lines in order to do this, you're going to want to think from the very beginning how you can show some kind of return on that investment. Your principal may not ask you for it, but having it to be able to provide it without them asking is gonna be beneficial to you. It's going to make sure the next time you ask for money, the next time you need a thing, that it gets taken care of. So this next question is kind of like transferring out of like the assessment aspect of it and more into like our current roles where we're helping faculty. And the student asks like, okay, there are people who are afraid of using technology, might even not be using it correctly. Do you have any advice for talking to these people about what they can be doing differently in their classroom?
Yes, is the short answer. We run into lots of faculty that are this way. And my sense is there are faculty that are afraid they're going to break the technology, whatever it is. And so sometimes it's let's help them get over that if we can. So let's get in and use technology and see what can happen, and try to look at, okay, if this goes wrong, what are we going to do? And have them help them come up with that process of what they're going to do if something goes wrong. And so it doesn't have to be a scary thing. That I see a lot of fear that comes out of this of like, oh my gosh, I'm just overwhelmed by that. The other thing I recommend a lot is like, and I did this in my classroom, was have one or two students be there to be your helpers. Students love being able to help out. And if you can be like, okay, I need some help with this, this, and this, and make it into a fun thing. Like, I know that I'm going to have problems with remembering where the volume is every single time. And this student is going to help me remember where the volume switch is, or whatever it is. We see that even at the college level. We have a lot of faculty that use teaching assistants to be able to help out with technology because they are so overwhelmed by it. And so kind of coming up with those, helping them find solutions that will help them be able to be more calm around the technology is what's most important. A lot of times you get in the moment, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't think of what the next thing is. And it's just helping kind of alleviate that more than anything. And so it's the trying to give as much detailed instruction as possible and leaving them with places where they can go and get additional resources, and then seeing what other supports they might need are the big things that I think about a lot. So I used to make a lot of just how-to instructions, finding a good screen capture tool. I use one called Screen Capture by TechSmith. There's the snipping tool, a lot of like screenshots of here's where you click next with the big arrow to it. So you can say, if I'm not around or nobody's around to help you, here's where you can go to do this next thing. I've been doing that since the time I was in teaching music and trying to help other faculty be able to do that. So trying to help just provide as many resources and alleviate fear and trepidation is
Yeah.
the biggest thing.
One thing I'll say on this topic is I never tell an instructor that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're talking about with the technology integration is new ways to teach or different ways to teach. And I always approach it from that lens. That's a personal thing for me because I had a supervisor early in my teaching career that kind of really believed in group work. And if you weren't doing it as group work, learning wasn't happening. And I had real problems with the way that like I wasn't being respected as an educator, right? Like that was personal to me. The choices you make in your classroom and how you're teaching is very personal. Now, do I also believe that there can be better things that you can do? And so that has always been important to me is I never tell them you're doing something wrong in the classroom. It's always, here's another tool for your toolbox. And even better if that tool is very need driven. Chilton was talking about earlier, the needs that you're trying to fill with the technology. What are you trying to do? What's your goal for this technology implementation? And if you focus on that and always think of what you're doing as professional development as being additive and not as a replacement, I think you're gonna develop better relationships with the people you're working with and work through it better. We're also in a situation where I don't know how to say this diplomatically. There's not a lot in higher education that's required of our faculty. They are given wide discretion about what happens inside their classroom, right? And so it's not that what they choose is not rigorous, but there's no like requirement like you must use this thing, you must teach it in this exact way. And so anytime that we can come in there and be like, okay, here's something you could do, or in the off chance that there is a requirement, now you're coming there and saying, I know this is a requirement, let me help you. And you're just there as the helper to help them get away from fear of that. And I think that approach has served both of us really well over time, because these are our colleagues. These are the people we work with every day. And, I just really never tell someone that like, oh, that's wrong.
Yeah.
I might not agree with someone, always doing lecture or always teaching everything the same exact way, but I'm going to approach it and be like, okay, here's a different tactic you could use.
Yeah. One other thing that I'll say here as a piece of advice is early on in computers, there's 10 different ways to do something. And I'm always looking for the shortcut on how to do it. And so I'm trying to find the fastest way to do it. And so people would do something where it'd take them 5 steps to get to the next step. And I'm like, oh, you could just do this and we'll get there quicker. And I realized that was just adding to the overwhelmed feeling that they already were. And so what I've come to say recently is when somebody's like, oh, I know I'm doing it the slow way. I'm like, no, 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 no. If you do it a way that works for you, that's the best way to do it. We're already asking you to add in something new. We're already talking. You've come here because you want to learn something new. Let's not add 10 different steps to now think about. When you know how to do it, it just might take 2 steps longer. And so I've really backed off on trying to be aware of like, what is the task at hand that we're trying to get to, and everything else. If they've got a way to do it, let them do it that way. Sometimes it might drive you nuts because it takes a long time, but in the end, they're going to be more successful because they can just think on the 1 or 2 things they need to change instead of this shortcut I've showed them in addition to this other little task I've showed them in addition to. And so I've really tried to simplify that process of like, no, recognize the things that you do know already and say, yes, that's a great way to do it to them. That's just going to help them feel, again, more calm and comfortable because we're putting them in a different learning situation. And so just trying to help them, again, alleviate those fears and that anxiety as much as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thank you. So next question is a little bit about how technology works at our institution. The question was, do all the technology tools that all the professors at the college use have to be evaluated and approved prior to use? Is it at the discretion of the professor to do their own research? How does this affect your job when it comes to assessing impact?
It's a great question, and it is one of the biggest differences between K-12 and higher ed. Ed talked about this earlier already. We at the higher ed, there's very few things that are required that faculty do with technology. When I worked at BOCES, we were constantly like, what is it that the district wants? What is it that's been vetted by the district? What is it that has been allowed by the district? What are the priorities of the district? When we at the higher ed institutions, it is not the same way. It is really what happens in the classroom is at the purview of the faculty member. So I think that answers kind of that first part of that question of is there a standardized thing? Now there are some standardized tools. We have a learning management system. Blackboard is ours currently. Moodle is another one that's out there. I'm trying to think of some of the other names of the ones that are specifically K-12, but there's a lot of
Schoology, Google
Yes.
Classroom.
Yes, thank you. And so there are some that we're asked to use, but how they use it is has a wide range of possibilities inside of it. So in our case, the only thing that they have to put there is their syllabus. Nothing else. They don't have to put anything else in there. So for us, that's a really easy one to assess. Do you have your syllabus in the LMS or not? Yes or no? And so that's a really easy question to be able to answer. So that's the first part of the question. As far as how faculty research that's very wide. Sometimes it's they just want to have a tool to be able to communicate with students. So they'll pick a tool where they can text easily with their students. And that for them, it's not an assessment of anything. That's just I want to communicate with you. If you want to put in your information here, then we can use this as a text chat instead of having to go through email all the time.
Now, Chilton, I just want to give you a little bit of background on this question.
Okay.
These students in the last couple of weeks have gone through and reviewed a HECVAT. So they've thought really deeply about security of online cloud tools and been reading about that and the regulatory framework of both higher ed and K through 12. That's really important. Last week, they looked at VPATs for different tools and just started to grow their awareness. Not that they're now an accessibility expert, but they just started to understand a little bit about what accessibility might mean when they're picking different types of tools. And I think that might be where this question is coming from a lot of times, especially when this person asked, is it on them to do their own research?
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So just to back up just a second before I get there, since the faculty member can do things in their own classroom, then it's really on them to do that type of research. Where we come involved is when we try to do project where it is more of a campus-wide tool that is going to be used. and do we want to implement that? Then we get involved in the research. So if a faculty member wants to go off and find a texting tool, we don't have a requirement on our campus that they show a VPAT or anything before doing that. But when we want to go out and find a system for plagiarism detection, and we go evaluate tools that we're going to use across the whole campus, then our office, the Teaching Learning Technology Center, works with the IT office. They have some groups that will go out and evaluate that, and we can look at things like Turnitin. Inside of Blackboard that we're using currently, they have one called Safe Assign. We can look and see what are the documentation that they have, and does it provide all the necessary things. When we go and look at things like open educational resources, and we look at something like one of the platforms you use called Lumen Learning, we can go out and do that. Or has that been done somewhere else inside of our system? Is somebody else in your district using that? Then you can go and do that. So for us, it's whenever it becomes something that is campus wide and we get involved, or not even campus wide, but something where we get involved, where we're trying to implement something, then we get involved with the assessment of it to see if it's a reliable tool that can be used.
I think it's okay to say to this group of students that sometimes it can be frustrating for the faculty members.
Yes.
I'll use the example. This class used Microsoft Teams to communicate back and forth and to work on some shared documents. Let's be honest, the standard in a lot of places is Google Drive. And I bet they've had instructors that would just prefer to be out on Google Drive and using a Google Doc than using a Microsoft Word 365 doc, right? So we allow the faculty member to make that decision. They can go out and use a Google Doc if they want to use a Google Doc. But are we trying to standardize as much as we possibly can? Oh, yeah. I mean, if you've got to use a different tool or a different app for every single one of your classes, that can be a lot of cognitive load that's necessary to be successful in your class. As much as we can to standardize on the institution-supported tools, we really try to. And so that's a competing pressure here of we're trying to be as open as we want and let faculty use the tools that they're comfortable with. Well, at the same time, it's also our responsibility to review HECFATs and VPATs and make sure things are secure and accessible and that we have options available. And that can be a really interesting dynamic that develops between the education technology professionals and the instructors. And I have no doubt that there's going to be some of that same dynamic in the K through 12 system that you're working in, where you might find like, oh, I can just use this tool right here. And your district says, oh, whoa, wait, we use Remind for communication with parents. That's what we've decided as a district. And I think you should be very aware of where you could be walking into kind of potential problems. And I can, especially as a young teacher, stay with the district's tech stack as much as possible.
Yeah, and I can talk about that from my experience with BOCES. When I was working with BOCES, we were school districts that we went into, and that was exactly what Ed's talking about. There are times where you would go in and be like, no, we have to use this tool. And it was when I first started working in higher ed, I was like, whoa, they don't have to do any of that stuff. They can go off all on their own. And then after about 2 years, I was like, whoa, they can go off all on their own and do whatever they want. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It does become harder because you do have a wider experience for your students. And so there is a balancing act there. I'll go back to Ed said that earlier too. Like there's a balancing act between trying to find new and innovative tools to be able to use, but also making sure that they fit inside of your school's guidelines or your district's guidelines. And using the tools that are there first. So if you're going to evaluate tools, and we do this too, whenever we can, we say, do we have something already that can do something that maybe it gets 90% of what we want? It doesn't have those 1 or 2 features that you love in Slack, but we do have those communication tools that will work well enough here. If we've already got it, let's use the ones that we have, both for the faculty and for your students, for teachers and for students. The more we can keep it consistent for the students across, I think the better, where we can, and then think about how we want to meaningfully push out new things from there.
Okay, I've got one last question back, and then it's when assessing the impact of technology within the college. It really, with this person goes into some very specifics about what data could look like, but I'm just going to rephrase and say, what makes the best data? What kind of data are you looking to collect when you're doing this type of assessment work?
Yeah, I just took a training on this recently, and it made me rethink what type of data I need. And it really goes back to what's the need you're trying to fill with this, and asking those questions before you get started. Because you can, like, one of the fascinating things about technology is you can generate a lot of data, and you can actually get into data overload if you're not careful with this. Because you're like, oh, we can track the number of logins on this thing, and oh, we can track how much time they spend in here. But that doesn't always get to the question of what's the need that you're trying to fill with this. And so that's the first thing I like to ask now is, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Go back to open educational resources again. We wanted to make it so that our students had more affordable textbooks. And so the data that we really need to collect was how much were they spending on textbook before and how much are they spending now? That data is out there, but you have to be a little more purposeful about finding some of the data, especially the data before. How much were they spending on textbook before wasn't always an easy question to answer. And so thinking through that need, whatever that need is you're trying to fill with this, is I think is most important. And then from there, you can come up with the questions that will say, what type of data do I want to get from this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just going to go with OER for a second, and I'm just going to give some examples of the types of things I report out on when I'm talking about OER. Okay, so OER, that's that open educational resources. Basically, you can think about them as free textbooks, but free in the fact that they're free of copyright. We can make them, copy them, they can be found online. So one of our goals was that we wanted this spread out across the entire college. So one of the things we did is we said, you know what? We're going to really focus on the general education curriculum. Let's think about how many of our gen eds we can do with OER textbooks. And so to spread that out across the whole curriculum, that was the goal. The assessment piece that we do is that we keep track of the percentage of gen ed courses that use OER. And so now when someone's saying like, oh, you work on OER a lot, I can say, yes, nearly 20% of our classes at SUNY Oneonta within the general education use OER. It's a percentage. It's counting numbers, okay? Okay, not everything's about just counting numbers, but one of our goals was to save students money. We read a lot of papers about what would be best to calculate, and they were advising us that, like, you know, figure each course that becomes an OER course saves the students $80. Well, now we can pull from what we keep track of all the courses that are OER, and we know how many students are in those courses. We can put together like a big number and say, oh, our OER initiative at SUNY Oneonta has saved over $750,000 for students for textbooks. Another counting number. I told you that sometimes it's really good to talk about exemplars, an example that really hits it home, someone that's just like doing really well. Okay, so I'll tell you, oh, our Spanish department at SUNY Oneonta created an original OER for their 101 and 102 classes, and that's being used all around SUNY. Not only are they using it, but it's spread to other campuses. So that's that example where it's not all about counting numbers, but I'm going to pick an illustrative example of what OER could be and use that to help tell my story about what OER is. Great. Then talk about learning, talk about the process. I like to always have things that are creative and the students are doing it. So I can say, oh, over the Cooperstown Graduate Program, which is our graduate school for early museum professionals, we had a really nice partnership where the students built an OER with their professor over time. They actually published a book and gave it to the Little Falls Historical Association. And that's the students did that. So now I have some counting numbers. And then I have some 2 great examples of how this could be done in class. And that helps me tell the story. And so when we think about assessment, it's not the same as a research study, but it's like, what data, what things can you collect along your time to tell your story the broadly? And that's got to go back to what Chilton said about the different audiences that you will use different parts of that data to different people.
Yeah, and I love that example because it does give some human perspective to it. It does give some stories to go along with that, and so it makes it a meaningful assessment. Yes, there's a lot of impact. You can show numbers, but you can also show meaningful impact to those students in the Cooperstown graduate program and what that meant to them as well. And so it's a neat way to be able to talk about it, to both show the breadth of it, but also the depth of it.
Chilton, I want to thank you for visiting with the class. I think this was really good, and I think they're going to get a lot out of this when they watch the video. So thank you for spending the time with us.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity, and good luck with all of the rest of your work in this class and the rest of your program.
Yeah, I hear the professor's a real jerk, so they're going to need that luck. All right.
Is there a secret word we have to say at the end, like gold coin or something, so they can? Okay.
No. All the good stuff's at the end anyway.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Chilton.
Thanks.
Bye.